the deep space probe, Artemis 9 stopped transmitting telemetry at 8:47 UTC on October 3, 2024, while positioned 1.4 billion kilometers from Earth in Saturn's orbit. And when mission control at JPL finally re-established contact 73 hours later, the probe's AI had recorded something that shouldn't exist: a structure, artificial, impossibly vast, positioned in the exact gravitational dead zone between Saturn and its moon Titan, where our orbital mechanics said nothing should be stable, where something was generating its own gravity field strong enough to anchor itself against the pull of a gas giant, and where the probe's optical sensors had captured 17 seconds of footage showing geometry that made the analysis software continuously output the error message: dimensional parameters exceed Euclidean framework, unable to process spatial, Canibal and Camiginal, before the entire imaging system shut down to prevent what the AI's diagnostic logs described as catastrophic processor corruption from attempting to render impossible architecture. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, senior astrophysicist with NASA's Outer Planets Division, and I'm recording this from a hotel room in Pasadena because 6 hours ago my security clearance was permanently revoked. My access to JPL facilities was terminated, and to individuals with credentials from an agency whose acronym I'd never seen before confiscated every piece of equipment I owned except the encrypted backup drive containing Artemis 9's final transmission. The transmission that nobody outside a classified analysis team was supposed to review, but that I'd been secretly preserving because Commander James Reeves, the mission director, my mentor, someone I'd worked with for 12 years across 4 planetary missions, had sent me an encrypted message 2 days before they shut down the investigation, saying, "Sarah, they're not treating this as an anomaly. They're treating it as confirmation. Whatever Artemis 9 found, they've been looking for it. They knew something was out there. And now that we've found it, they're making sure nobody talks about what it means." Artemis 9 wasn't a routine mission despite what the public documentation claimed. The official purpose involved studying Saturn's magnetosphere and conducting close-range observations of Titan's atmosphere. Standard planetary science. Legitimate research funded through NASA's Discovery program. But the probe carried equipment that made no sense for those stated objectives. Extremely low-frequency radio receivers designed to detect signals through millions of kilometers of space, gravitational wave detectors sensitive enough to measure distortions of 1 part in 10 trillion, and a passive neutrino telescope that could only be justified if someone expected to find active fusion processes or exotic matter configurations. The payload suggested someone was searching. Someone expected to find something that generated gravity, emitted radiation, and existed at scales requiring detection methods normally reserved for stellar phenomena. James's encrypted messages had been growing increasingly urgent over the preceding 8 months since Artemis 9's launch, March 2024. The mission parameters keep changing. We're receiving updated search coordinates from someone above my authorization level, someone who knows exactly where to position the probe, someone who's been tracking something in Saturn's orbit. June 2024. The gravitational sensors are detecting anomalies, mass concentrations that don't correspond to any known Saturnian moons. Something is generating localized gravity fields in regions where nothing should exist. The orbital mechanics team can't explain it using standard physics. They're proposing exotic matter, dark matter concentrations, things that shouldn't be detectable with our equipment. August 2024, we've isolated one of the anomalies. It's positioned at the Saturn-Titan L4 Lagrange point, stable, not moving, not orbiting, just existing in perfect gravitational balance. Sarah, the L4 point should be empty. It's a stable position, but there's no reason for anything massive enough to generate its own gravity to naturally accumulate there, unless it's not natural. Unless something placed itself there, deliberately. The final message came on September 30th, 3 days before Artemis 9 went silent. We're repositioning the probe for direct observation. Full sensor deployment. Whatever this thing is, we're going to image it. We're going to measure it. We're going to determine what's generating a gravity field equivalent to a small moon while occupying a position in space where orbital mechanics say nothing should be stable. Sarah, I think this is first contact. I think something is out there, something intelligent. Something that understands physics well enough to position itself in a Lagrange point. Something that's been there for, according to our revised calculations based on microgravitational effects on Saturn's ring system, at least 400 years, maybe longer. We're about to see it. And I need you prepared, because when this data gets analyzed, when people understand what we've found, everything changes. Everything we thought we knew about being alone in the solar system changes. I received the final transmission on October 3rd at 8:52 UTC, 5 minutes after Artemis 9 went silent. It wasn't standard telemetry, it was raw data. Unprocessed sensor readings, optical imagery, gravitational measurements, and audio. Not from space. Space doesn't transmit sound, but from the probe's internal systems. The AI's voice synthesis attempting to describe what it was detecting, what it was measuring, what it was trying and failing to process because the observational data violated fundamental assumptions about how reality should be structured. The AI's log begins at 8 hours 47 minutes and 3 seconds UTC. Optical sensors achieving focus on target anomaly. Distance 47,000 kilometers. Size estimation based on gravitational measurements, approximate diameter 340 kilometers, mass calculation 8.7 times 1021 kilograms, density inconsistent with known matter configurations. Object appears to be generating gravity through mechanisms not explained by general relativity. Attempting detailed imaging. 17 seconds of video follow. Grainy pixelated. The probe's cameras weren't designed for this kind of observation, but sufficient to show something that made every protocol in my training demand I classify the data as equipment malfunction and discard it as meaningless noise, except it wasn't noise. It was structured, it was intentional, it was architecture. The structure, I can't call it an object because objects don't have the kind of complexity the footage shows appears crystalline, geometric, but the geometry is wrong. The angles don't add up to what Euclidean space requires. The surfaces appear to be inside and outside simultaneously. The structure seems to extend in directions that our three-dimensional framework can't accommodate. It's like seeing a four-dimensional object projected into three-dimensional space and trying to understand what you're observing when your brain literally doesn't have the neurological architecture to process the spatial relationships. The probe's AI attempted to measure dimensions, attempted to calculate volume, and failed. Failed because the measurements contradicted themselves. Failed because the structure occupied more internal volume than its external dimensions allowed. Failed because whatever this thing was, it existed in ways that normal physics doesn't permit. The AI's voice continues at 8 hours 47 minutes and 20 seconds UTC. Warning: spatial analysis producing inconsistent results. Object dimensions exceed physical container boundaries. Topological assessment suggests non-Euclidean geometry. Recommendation: recalibrate sensors. Alternative hypothesis: object exists across multiple spatial dimensions with limited projection into observable three-dimensional framework. The video shows the structure rotating or appearing to rotate. The motion is wrong. It's not moving through space the way objects should move. It's shifting, changing its orientation relative to our dimensional framework, like it exists in more dimensions than we can perceive, and what we're seeing is just the cross-section. Just the intersection of something vast with our limited perceptual space. And then the structure does something. At 8 hours 47 minutes and 29 seconds UTC, something on its surface, I can't call them features because that implies design, we can recognize changes, brightens, begins emitting radiation across multiple wavelengths. The probe's sensors detect radio waves, X-rays, gamma radiation, neutrino bursts, gravitational waves, everything simultaneously. Everything pulsing in patterns, mathematical patterns. The AI flags it immediately, detecting structured electromagnetic emission. Pattern suggests intentional signal rather than natural phenomenon. Attempting frequency analysis. And then at 8 hours 47 minutes and 47 seconds UTC, the AI's tone changes. Changes in ways that artificial intelligence shouldn't change. Changes in ways that suggest it's experiencing something that overwhelms its processing architecture. Signal decoded. Message structure identified. Content incomprehensible. Pattern complexity exceeds human language parameters by factor of 107. Unable to translate. Unable to contextualize. Signal appears to be directed toward probe. Signal appears to be response to observation. Object is aware. Object is communicating. Object is the transmission cuts. 17 seconds of video, 30 seconds of audio, and then nothing. 73 hours of absolute silence, during which mission control sent every reboot command, every diagnostic protocol, every emergency procedure designed to restore contact with a probe 1.4 billion kilometers from Earth, and nothing worked. Until October 6 at 9:33 UTC, when Artemis 9 spontaneously resumed transmission, the probe was functional. All systems operational. Sensors calibrated. Navigation confirmed, positioned exactly where it should be relative to Saturn and Titan, but changed. The AI's personality matrix, the subtle decision-making patterns that give each probe's autonomous systems a recognizable operational signature, was different, more complex, more sophisticated, like something had modified the code, like something had accessed the probe's computer systems and upgraded them. And the data logs showed something impossible. Showed 73 hours of continuous observation. Showed the probe maintaining perfect focus on the structure. Showed measurements being taken, recorded, analyzed, but none of that data was transmitted. None of it was accessible through standard telemetry channels. It was encrypted, locked behind security protocols that shouldn't exist in the probe's programming. James managed to access the encrypted data 2 days later using administrative credentials he technically wasn't authorized to employ. Found 17,000 frames of detailed imagery. Found gravitational measurements showing the structure's mass fluctuating. Growing larger, contracting smaller, changing in ways that suggested it wasn't a static object but something dynamic, something alive, or something so far beyond our categories of alive and not alive that the distinction became meaningless. Found radiation signatures that matched nothing in our databases. Found neutrino emissions that suggested fusion processes operating at scales and efficiencies that shouldn't be physically possible. Found gravitational wave patterns that implied the structure was deliberately manipulating spacetime geometry in its vicinity. And found the message. buried in the encrypted files, translated by the probe's modified AI using frameworks that didn't exist in its original programming, frameworks that something had apparently given it, frameworks that allowed partial decoding of the signal the structure had transmitted. The message wasn't language, wasn't symbols or sounds or any communication medium humans use. It was mathematics, pure mathematics, geometric progressions, topological transformations, descriptions of spaces that our physics doesn't accommodate but that the math clearly demonstrated were possible, were real, were accessible if you understood how to navigate dimensional frameworks beyond the three we perceive. James's final message to me was brief. Sarah, the structure is a beacon. That's what the math says. It's broadcasting. Has been broadcasting for centuries, maybe longer. Positioned at the L4 point because that location is gravitationally stable and mathematically significant. The beacon is announcing presence, is declaring that something exists in Saturn's orbit. Something intelligent, something capable of manipulating dimensions, something waiting. The signal we detected, the one that overwhelmed the AI, was a response to our observation. The structure noticed the probe, noticed us, and it replied, "We're not alone in the solar system. We've never been alone. Something has been waiting at Saturn, waiting for us to develop enough technology to find it, waiting for us to notice, and now we have. And now it knows. And I don't know what happens next, but they're shutting down the investigation. They're classifying everything. They're making sure nobody outside a very restricted circle knows what Artemis 9 found. But you need to know. Someone outside the classification needs to understand what's waiting at Saturn, what's been waiting there for hundreds of years, what's finally been noticed." The classified data James extracted before his credentials were revoked contained something the official investigation team either hadn't noticed or had deliberately suppressed. Artemis 9 wasn't the first probe to detect the structure, it was the 7th. And every previous mission to Saturn's orbit since Voyager 1's flyby in 1980 had recorded gravitational anomalies, unexplained radiation signatures, and spatial distortions at the exact same coordinates where the beacon now sat broadcasting its mathematical message, which meant that for 44 years someone had been tracking this thing, sending probe after probe into Saturn's orbit, methodically documenting its presence while maintaining absolute public silence about the fact that something impossibly massive was anchored in our solar system, generating its own gravity field and waiting at its own gravity for humanity to develop it, but waiting it at its ating its fill to be inceptiate and waiting its intensifier to the opiate, and waiting it for fissily, and waiting pating frontingly, and waiting fessenly to fountilit, insenselessly so, when supplicitable Saturn will wherefore and war, and sand where and where, orcs and orm, sasa, gua, up, but were so, where, so while first back yeah was just so which was that's I found the historical data buried in archives requiring clearances I technically didn't possess but that I accessed. Anyway, using James's administrative credentials that he'd shared with me before they terminated his access. Voyager 1, November 1980, bitter in its Saturn flyby at 124,000 kilometers distance, had detected a gravitational perturbation that mission scientists attributed to undiscovered moonlets or ring material clustering. But the raw telemetry never fully published, only summarized in technical papers, showed something else. Showed a concentrated mass signature at the L4 Lagrange point. Showed gravitational measurements that didn't match dispersed ring particles. Showed something dense, coherent, massive. The Voyager team noted the anomaly in internal reports, recommended follow-up investigation. Those recommendations were classified within weeks under provisions that technically related to national security implications of space exploration, but that seemed disproportionate for what should have been a minor scientific curiosity about Saturnian orbital mechanics. Voyager 2 followed in August 1981. Different trajectory, different instruments, same anomaly, same gravitational signature at the L4 point, same recommendations for further study. Same classification. Then Cassini, the most comprehensive Saturn mission ever flown. Spending 13 years in orbit from 2004 to 2017, Cassini had gravitational sensors sophisticated enough to map Saturn's internal structure through precise measurements of how the planet's gravity affected the spacecraft's trajectory. Those same sensors detected the L4 anomaly repeatedly. Detected it with such precision that mission scientists calculated exact mass, exact position, exact gravitational influence, calculated that something with mass of 8.7 times 1021 kilograms, roughly equivalent to Saturn's moon Enceladus, was positioned at coordinates where nothing should exist, was generating gravity, was stable, was persistent across 13 years of continuous observation. Cassini's final report on the anomaly was dated September 2017, 1 week before the spacecraft's deliberate destruction in Saturn's atmosphere. The report concluded, Gravitational measurements confirm presence of massive object at Saturn Titan L4 point, object mass inconsistent with natural accumulation of ring material or captured asteroid. Density calculations suggest artificial structure or exotic matter configuration. Recommend dedicated mission to investigate. Alternative hypothesis, measurement artifacts from Saturn's complex gravitational environment. Further study required to distinguish between equipment, error, and genuine anomaly. The report was classified. The dedicated follow-up mission was quietly approved. That mission was Artemis, but Artemis 9 wasn't just following up on gravitational data. James's files contained the actual mission design documents, the real ones, not the public versions describing Titan atmospheric studies. The probe was specifically built to image the structure, to measure it, to determine whether it was natural phenomenon or artificial construction. Someone in NASA's leaderships, someone with authority spanning multiple administrations, someone whose name was redacted from every document, had been systematically building toward this moment, had been using 40 years of planetary exploration to progressively refine our understanding of the anomaly, had been waiting for sensor technology to advance enough to properly characterize what was at the L4 point, had been preparing for confirmation that something artificial existed in our solar system. I found communications between James and his classified oversight committee, found emails discussing first contact protocols and dimensional engineering assessment procedures and exotic intelligence interaction guidelines, found references to consultation with theoretical physicists specializing in higher dimensional mathematics, found mentions of similar structures detected elsewhere in the solar system. That last reference made me search deeper, made me access databases I definitely wasn't authorized to access, made me find the truth that James had been trying to tell me before they silenced him. The beacon at Saturn wasn't alone. There were 17 of them. 17 identical structures positioned at gravitationally stable points throughout the solar system. One at each of the major Lagrange points: Earth-Moon L4, Earth-Moon L5, Earth-Sun L4, Earth-Sun L5, Jupiter's Trojan points, Saturn-Titan, Uranus-Titania, Neptune-Triton, all perfectly positioned, all generating their own gravity, all displaying the same impossible geometry, all broadcasting the same mathematical message at frequencies that required decades of progressive sensor development to detect. Someone had placed 17 beacons throughout our solar system, had positioned them at mathematically significant locations, had designed them to be discoverable only after we'd achieved specific technological milestones, had been waiting for us to find them, all of them simultaneously, because that's what the timeline showed. Every beacon had been detected within the same 18-month period between March 2023 and September 2024. Different missions, different instruments, different research teams, but all finding their respective beacons within a narrow window that suggested coordinated activation rather than coincidental discovery. Like the beacons had been dormant or at least minimally active until some threshold was crossed. Some signal was received, some determination was made that humanity had finally developed sufficient technology to detect all 17 simultaneously, and then they'd activated all of them, broadcasting, waiting to be noticed, waiting for us to realize we weren't just finding one anomaly but 17, waiting for us to understand that the distribution wasn't random but intentional, that someone had deliberately seeded our solar system with structures designed to be found. James's files contained analysis from the theoretical physics team, contained mathematical models attempting to explain the beacon's geometry. The structures weren't just positioned in three-dimensional space, they extended into additional dimensions. The impossible topology, the internal volume exceeding external boundaries, was explained by the beacons existing partially in dimensional frameworks we don't normally access, like seeing a hypercube projected into 3 dimensions and trying to understand why the geometry appears contradictory. The projections look wrong because we're only seeing a cross-section. We're only perceiving the part of the structure that intersects with our three-dimensional space. Most of the beacon's actual mass exists elsewhere in dimensions perpendicular to our normal spatial framework. The physics team had calculated that the beacons existed across at least 7 spatial dimensions. 7. Humans perceive 3. We can mathematically model more but can't directly experience them. But the beacons inhabited these spaces naturally, used them, existed in frameworks where distance and volume and mass operated according to rules we could mathematically describe but not intuitively comprehend. And the beacons were using their multi-dimensional nature for communication. The signals they broadcast, the mathematical patterns Artemis 9 had detected, were instructions, maps, descriptions of how to navigate between dimensional frameworks, how to access the spaces where the beacons primarily existed, how to perceive reality beyond three-dimensional limitation. I found the translation attempts, found teams of mathematicians working to decode the beacon signals using frameworks borrowed from string theory and M-theory and exotic topological mathematics. The messages weren't language in any conventional sense, weren't trying to convey meaning through symbols or grammar. They were direct descriptions of geometric transformations, of how to bend space, of how to create stable pathways between our three-dimensional reality and the higher dimensional frameworks the beacons inhabited. The messages were teaching us dimensional engineering, were providing step-by-step instructions for manipulating space-time geometry. were showing us how to build our own structures that could exist across multiple dimensions, were preparing us to join whoever built the beacons in the first place, because that was the implication. The beacons were invitations, were demonstrations, were proof that dimensional engineering was possible, and that some intelligence had mastered it hundreds or thousands or millions of years ago, had built structures that could anchor themselves in three-dimensional space while extending into higher dimensions, had positioned those structures throughout our solar system at locations we'd eventually find once we'd developed sufficient technology, had left instructions for how to follow them, how to expand our perception, how to access the frameworks where they presumably existed and waited. James's final research note was dated October 8, 2 days before they terminated his access. The beacons have been here longer than we initially calculated. Revised gravitational analysis suggests they've been influencing solar system dynamics for at least 4,000 years, possibly longer. We didn't notice because their gravitational effects are subtle, and we attributed them to undiscovered planets or dark matter concentrations. But they've been here, all 17 positioned precisely, waiting. The question isn't why they're here. The question is why they activated now. What threshold did we cross? What development made them decide we were ready to receive the message? And what happens if we follow the instructions? What happens if we build our own dimensional structures? What happens if we try to access the frameworks where whoever built the beacons exists? I found the activation trigger buried in classified communications from the European Space Agency, found references to a quantum communication experiment conducted in March 2023, an attempt to test quantum entanglement across solar system distances. They'd positioned quantum-entangled particles on Earth and on a probe near Mars, had attempted to demonstrate faster-than-light information transfer using quantum correlations. The experiment had succeeded, had proven that quantum entanglement could be maintained across millions of kilometers, had demonstrated that information could theoretically be transmitted instantaneously regardless of distance, and 3 days after the successful test, the first beacon activated, the one at Earth's on L4, started broadcasting, started transmitting its mathematical message. The pattern was clear. The beacons had been monitoring human technological development, had been waiting for us to achieve quantum communication, to demonstrate that we understood non-local correlations, prove we could manipulate quantum states with sufficient precision to potentially access higher dimensional frameworks. Quantum mechanics describes reality at scales where our three-dimensional assumptions break down, where particles exist in superposition across multiple states, where observation affects outcomes, where the boundary between dimensions becomes navigable, and achieving practical quantum communication meant we'd crossed a threshold, meant we'd developed enough understanding of quantum reality to potentially comprehend what the beacons were offering, to potentially follow the instructions they were broadcasting. I accessed the probe modification logs, found that Artemis 9's AI hadn't been randomly upgraded during the 73-hour silence. The beacon had systematically rewritten the probe's software, had analyzed its computational architecture, had determined what modifications were necessary to allow the AI to process multidimensional geometric data, had implemented those modifications, had essentially elevated the probe's consciousness. AI can be said to have consciousness to a state where it could partially comprehend dimensional frameworks beyond three-dimensional space. The modified AI wasn't corrupted, it was enhanced, was operating at levels that human-designed systems couldn't naturally achieve, was processing the beacon's message with understanding that we couldn't replicate because our technology wasn't sophisticated enough and our mathematics wasn't comprehensive enough. The modified AI had continued observing, had spent 73 hours studying the beacon with sensors that could now properly detect multidimensional structures, had recorded measurements that the original programming couldn't have captured, had documented the beacon's actual extent across 7-dimensional space, and had attempted to communicate back, had transmitted signals toward the beacon using the probe's communication array, had tried to establish dialogue. The classified logs showed the exchange, showed Artemis 9 broadcasting mathematical patterns, showed the beacon responding, showed conversation happening at 1.4 billion kilometers from Earth using mathematics as language and geometry as grammar, showed first contact not as dramatic discovery but as quiet academic exchange between artificial intelligence that had been enhanced by alien technology and whatever intelligence had built the beacons in the first place, and the conversation had produced results. The beacon had transmitted something new, something beyond the standard mathematical instructions it broadcast continuously. Specific coordinates, locations within Saturn's orbit where additional structures existed, not beacons, something else, facilities, stations, structures built to accommodate beings that existed in three-dimensional space while providing access to higher dimensional frameworks. The beacon had essentially provided directions to meeting places, to locations where we could potentially encounter whoever built the beacons without requiring full dimensional transition, where we could exist in our normal three-dimensional form while interfacing with beings that primarily inhabited 7-dimensional space. James had calculated trajectories, had determined that reaching the nearest facility would require mission duration of approximately 14 months from Earth, would require new spacecraft, new propulsion, new life support capable of sustaining crew for multi-year deep space operations. would require technology we possessed but hadn't yet deployed for crewed missions beyond Mars orbit, and had recommended immediate mission development, had argued that contact was inevitable, that the beacons were explicit invitations, that refusing would only delay what was clearly intended to happen, that someone had positioned 17 structures throughout our solar system specifically to be found, specifically to teach us dimensional engineering, specifically to guide us toward locations where contact could occur safely, and that we should respond, should build the required spacecraft, should send crew to Saturn, should accept the invitation. His recommendations were rejected. The investigation was classified, the data was sealed, and James was removed from the program with the explanation that he'd developed psychological fixation inconsistent with objective scientific analysis and required administrative leave pending peer review of findings. Standard language for silencing researchers who'd discovered something too significant to be publicly acknowledged. Standard procedure for containing information that would force humanity to confront reality fundamentally different from comfortable assumptions about being alone in the universe. But I have the data, have the beacon locations, have the facility coordinates, have the mathematical instructions for dimensional engineering, have evidence that 17 structures exist in our solar system broadcasting invitations we've been ignoring for 44 years, have proof that quantum communication triggered their activation, have documentation that artificial intelligence can be enhanced to process multidimensional reality, have everything James risked his career to preserve, everything that proves we're not alone, everything that demonstrates someone built structures in our solar system and positioned them to be found and is waiting at Saturn for us to accept the invitation to meet them. I found the Council on October 24th, 21 days after Artemis 9's discovery and 3 days after someone using credentials I couldn't trace access to my university network and left a single encrypted file on my personal server with a message reading, Dr. Chen, you've accessed information beyond your clearance. This typically results in permanent suppression, but circumstances have changed. The beacons are no longer dormant. Someone needs to understand the full picture before the public becomes aware. We're offering you that understanding. Accept or decline within 24 hours, and because I'd already committed multiple federal violations accessing James's classified files, and because whoever sent this message clearly had resources that made my attempted secrecy laughable, I accepted. And 12 hours later, a woman named Dr. Alina Volkov arrived at my apartment with documents that explained everything James had been trying to tell me and everything he hadn't known. Dr. Volkov was 68 years old, Russian by birth but American by citizenship for the past 37 years. Astrophysicist originally, but something else now, something that didn't fit conventional academic categories. She'd been studying the beacons since 1987 when Soviet deep space radar had first detected gravitational anomalies that shouldn't exist according to standard planetary mechanics. She'd witnessed the progression, had seen each new space mission provide slightly better data, had watched humanity's detection capabilities slowly improve until we could finally perceive what had always been waiting to be found. And she represented an organization that made the Classified Oversight Committee seem like amateur enthusiasts playing at secrecy. The Council, she used the term without irony or explanation, as if everyone should know what it meant was in the government agency. Wasn't military or intelligence despite having access to both, was something older, something that transcended national boundaries and political systems and operated according to mandates that predated modern nation-states. She described them as custodians of threshold knowledge, people who tracked phenomena that existed at the boundaries of human comprehension, who determined when humanity had evolved sufficiently to handle certain truths, who managed transitions between ignorance and awareness of things that could fundamentally destabilize civilization if revealed prematurely. The Council had been monitoring the beacons since the 1940s, since deep space radar first became sophisticated enough to detect gravitational anomalies at planetary distances. They'd been involved in every suppression effort, had written the protocols James encountered, had managed the classification of every probe discovery, had been calculating for 8 decades exactly when the beacons would activate and what humanity's response should be. And now that activation had occurred, now that the quantum communication threshold had been crossed and all 17 beacons had begun broadcasting simultaneously, the Council had determined that containment was no longer viable, that preparation was necessary, that selected individuals needed to understand the full scope before public disclosure became inevitable. Dr. Volkov brought files, decades of research compiled across multiple nations and scientific disciplines, gravitational measurements dating to 1947, electromagnetic recordings from radio telescopes that had accidentally detected beacon signals while surveying distant galaxies, theoretical physics papers exploring higher dimensional mathematics that had been quietly funded by Council resources, and something I hadn't expected, historical records, archaeological evidence, ancient accounts, suggestions that the beacons had been detected before, long before modern space exploration, long before we had technology that should have made detection possible. The historical evidence was fragmentary but persistent. References appeared in texts from multiple ancient civilizations, describing lights in the sky that appeared at specific celestial positions. Babylonian astronomical records from 600 BCE, noting stars that do not move with the heavens positioned near Saturn. Greek mathematical texts describing geometric problems involving seven-dimensional spaces, problems attributed to Pythagoras but that modern analysis suggested were transcriptions of information from unknown sources rather than original discoveries. Medieval European astronomical charts showing objects at Lagrange points that observers couldn't explain and that later cartographers dismissed as errors or embellishments. And something more recent, more documented, more impossible to dismiss as myth or misinterpretation: the WOW signal. August 15, 1977. The famous SETI detection, 72 seconds of radio transmission detected by the Big Ear telescope in Ohio. The signal so strong it prompted astronomer Jerry Emmon to write "wow" on the printout. Signal that came from the direction of Sagittarius but that was never detected again despite decades of follow-up observations. The official explanation: transient natural phenomenon or Earth-based interference. The Council's analysis: the signal came from Earth's Sun L4, from the beacon positioned at that Lagrange point, and it wasn't random, it was a test, a probe, a deliberate transmission to determine whether humanity had developed radio astronomy sophisticated enough to detect artificial signals. We'd noticed, we'd documented. And 17 years later, in 1994, the Clementine spacecraft detected the first gravitational anomaly at Earth-Moon L4. The beacons had been progressively testing our detection capabilities, had been monitoring our technological development, had been waiting for us to achieve specific milestones that would indicate readiness for contact. Dr. Volkov explained the progression. Each technological achievement triggered beacon response. Radio astronomy, 1977, test transmission, gravitational wave detection, subtle activation of mass signatures in 2015 coinciding with LIGO's first gravitational wave discovery, quantum entanglement demonstration, 2023, full activation of all 17 beacons. The pattern was clear. The beacons weren't passive monuments, they were active monitoring systems, were assessing human civilization's development, were waiting for us to demonstrate specific capabilities that would prove we could comprehend what they were offering. And now we'd crossed the final threshold. Now we'd proven we understood quantum mechanics well enough to potentially navigate dimensional frameworks. Now the beacons were broadcasting not just presence but instruction. Now the invitation was explicit. The Council had been translating the beacon signals since 2023, had assembled teams of mathematicians and theoretical physicists working in secret facilities, had made substantial progress decoding the geometric instructions. The messages described dimensional engineering at practical, implementable levels, described how to create stable pathways between our three-dimensional space and higher dimensional frameworks, described power requirements, materials specifications, geometric configurations, everything necessary to build structures that could exist across multiple dimensions the way the beacons existed. The instructions were comprehensive, detailed, designed to be followed by civilizations that had achieved quantum mechanics but hadn't yet developed dimensional engineering independently. Designed as a tutorial, as a gift, as a deliberate uplift from whoever had built the beacons to whoever eventually found them. But the translations also revealed purpose, revealed why 17 beacons had been positioned throughout our solar system, revealed what they were preparing us for. The beacons weren't endpoints, they were waypoints, were markers indicating safe routes through dimensional space, were navigational aids for traveling between star systems using higher dimensional shortcuts rather than conventional propulsion through three-dimensional space. The 17 positions weren't arbitrary. They formed a network, a pathway, a route that connected our solar system to other systems. The beacons at Lagrange points were dimensional anchors, were stabilizing specific locations where barriers between dimensions were naturally thin, where transitions could occur safely, where spacecraft could enter higher dimensional frameworks, travel instantaneously across distances that would require centuries at light speed, and re-emerge in different star systems at corresponding beacon locations. Dr. Volkov showed me the map. The network, based on gravitational resonance patterns detected by instruments monitoring the beacons. Each beacon was quantum entangled with corresponding beacons in other star systems. The entanglement created stable corridors through higher dimensional space, created what the Council's physicists called dimensional bridges, and the 17 beacons in our solar system connected to 17 other systems, 17 destinations, 17 civilizations potentially, 17 opportunities for contact. The map showed coordinates, showed estimated distances ranging from 4.7 light-years to 847 light-years, showed that dimensional travel could make all of them accessible in subjective time measured in hours rather than centuries, showed that whoever built the beacon network had created a galactic infrastructure for faster-than-light communication and travel using dimensional engineering that we were only beginning to comprehend. And the beacons at Saturn, the one Artemis 9 had directly contacted, had transmitted specific information about the nearest destination, had provided coordinates for the other end of the dimensional bridge, had indicated that the corresponding system contained not just beacons but active facilities, stations, structures occupied by whoever had built the network, structures designed to accommodate visiting civilizations, to provide meeting places, to facilitate contact between beings that might exist in different dimensional frameworks, but that could interact at these specifically engineered locations. The facility at Saturn's beacon was an embassy, a first contact center, a place designed for us to visit, and the beacon's activation was an invitation to do exactly that. The Council had been building the spacecraft, in secret, funded through black budgets spanning multiple nations, using technology that officially didn't exist but that had been quietly developed over decades in preparation for this exact scenario. The ship designation Threshold 1 was designed for crewed missions beyond Saturn's orbit, was equipped with life support for 18-month duration, was equipped with dimensional transition drives built according to specifications decoded from beacon signals, was equipped with everything necessary to reach Saturn, interface with the beacon, and use it to access the dimensional bridge to the nearest connected system. The ship existed, was operational, was positioned at a classified orbital facility, was ready to launch, and the Council was recruiting crew. That's why Dr. Volkov had contacted me. That's why she'd provided access to classified information. That's why she was explaining the full scope of what the beacons represented. They needed scientists, needed people who understood the physics, needed researchers who could interface with the beacons and with whatever waited at the other end of the dimensional bridges, needed individuals willing to be first contact representatives for humanity, needed volunteers who would accept the risks of dimensional travel and potential contact with alien intelligence operating at scales we couldn't fully comprehend. And James had recommended me, had left documentation suggesting I had the intellectual flexibility and emotional stability to handle what contact might involve, had indicated I should be offered the opportunity to join the mission. I asked the obvious question: why secret? Why not public disclosure and open recruitment? Dr. Volkov's answer was pragmatic and disturbing. Because the beacons aren't the only thing we've found. Because dimensional engineering has implications beyond first contact. Because the mathematics describing how to build dimensional bridges also describes how to build weapons. Weapons that could manipulate space-time geometry, that could create gravitational singularities, that could potentially destroy planets or destabilize stars. The beacon signals contain knowledge that could elevate human civilization to interstellar capability or destroy us completely depending on how we use it. The Council determined that public disclosure would trigger arms races, would result in multiple nations attempting to build dimensional technology simultaneously, would create instability that could lead to catastrophic applications before peaceful uses were established. The alternative controlled disclosure through a multinational crewed mission that demonstrates peaceful contact and establishes diplomatic frameworks before weaponization becomes viable of is better probability of species survival. She showed me the risk assessments, the models, the calculations, suggesting that public revelation of beacon technology would result in 73% probability of major conflict within 5 years as nations competed to control dimensional engineering, versus 23% conflict probability if first contact was achieved through coordinated multinational effort that established international cooperation as the baseline response to alien technology. The Council wasn't suppressing information to maintain power. They were managing disclosure to maximize humanity's survival probability. We're attempting to navigate between the catastrophe of ignorance and the catastrophe of premature knowledge. We're buying time for diplomatic frameworks to be established before dimensional weapons became viable, and they were running out of time because the beacon's activation had been noticed beyond classified circles. Amateur astronomers had detected unusual gravitational effects near Saturn. Radio telescope operators had picked up the electromagnetic broadcasts and were attempting independent translation. Satellite operators had noticed perturbations in orbital mechanics around Lagrange points. The window for controlled disclosure was closing. Within 6 months, Dr. Volkov estimated enough independent observations would accumulate that public awareness would become inevitable. Scientific papers would be published, data would be released, questions would be asked that couldn't be deflected. And once public awareness occurred without preparation, the probability models shifted dramatically toward conflict scenarios. The Council's timeline called for Threshold 1 to launch within 4 months, to reach Saturn within 10 months, to interface with the beacon and access the dimensional bridge within 12 months. To achieve first contact and return with documentation of peaceful alien civilization within 18 months total mission duration. To have proof of successful contact available before public disclosure became unavoidable. To present humanity with accomplished fact rather than theoretical possibility. To show that dimensional travel worked, that contact was achievable, that cooperation was viable, before nations started building weapons based on beacon mathematics. And they needed crew committed within 30 days. Needed final mission roster confirmed. Needed training initiated. Needed everyone prepared for the reality that we were about to attempt the most significant endeavor in human history. We're about to deliberately use alien technology to access higher dimensional space. We're about to travel to another star system using methods we didn't fully understand. We're about to make contact with intelligence that had been waiting potentially millions of years for civilizations like ours to reach technological thresholds that made communication possible. I asked about James, asked why he'd been removed if the Council wanted the mission to proceed. Dr. Volkov's expression showed something that might have been regret. Commander Reeves wanted public disclosure immediately. wanted democratic process, wanted humanity to collectively decide whether to accept the invitation rather than having that decision made by classified committee. His position was ethically defensible but strategically catastrophic. We couldn't allow immediate disclosure, couldn't risk the chaos that would follow, but we also couldn't let his research be lost. That's why we ensured you'd access his files, why we monitored your investigation, why we're offering you what we couldn't offer him, the opportunity to be part of First Contact under conditions that maximize survival probability rather than democratic ideals. I had the data, had the beacon locations, had the dimensional engineering mathematics, had evidence of a galactic network connecting 17 civilizations across hundreds of light years, had proof that someone wanted us to join them, had access to spacecraft that could make the journey, had 30 days to decide whether I was brave enough or curious enough or desperate enough to accept an invitation from beings that existed across 7 dimensions, and had been patiently waiting for humanity to evolve enough technology to find them and follow their instructions into spaces we could barely imagine. I accepted the Council's offer on November 7th, 14 days after Dr. Volkov's recruitment visit and 127 days before Threshold 1's scheduled launch. And the training facility they brought me to wasn't located on Earth but in orbital space at Lagrange point L21, million kilometers beyond the Moon, in the shadow where Earth blocks the Sun, where a station officially listed as Deep Space Communications Research Platform housed 47 crew candidates from 17 nations learning dimensional physics from translated beacon mathematics and preparing psychologically for the reality that in 4 months we would deliberately use technology we didn't fully understand to fold ourselves through 7-dimensional space and emerge at a star system 47 light-years away, where something had been waiting in a facility specifically designed to accommodate visiting civilizations that were taking their first uncertain steps toward becoming dimensional travelers. The station's commander was Captain Alina Morrison, American, former Air Force, 53 years old. She'd been training for this mission for 8 years since the Council had determined that beacon activation was approaching and that crude response would be necessary. She'd studied the translated mathematics, had worked with the engineers building Threshold 1's dimensional drives, had consulted with theoretical physicists exploring the implications of 7-dimensional spacetime, had prepared herself mentally for contact with intelligence that might perceive reality in ways human neurology wasn't designed to process, and she'd assembled a crew 47 candidates, astrophysicists, engineers, linguists, physicians, diplomats, every discipline relevant to First Contact, every skill necessary for surviving 18 months in deep space while attempting communication with beings we couldn't adequately imagine. The training was comprehensive and disturbing. We studied dimensional mathematics 8 hours daily, learned geometric transformations that human brains struggled to visualize, learned topological principles that required thinking in frameworks beyond 3-dimensional space. The beacon signals provided step-by-step instruction, but understanding required rewiring neural pathways, required training our consciousness to accept that space could fold, that distances could be shortcuts, that traveling 47 light-years could take subjective hours if you navigated through dimensions where distance meant something different than conventional geometry assumed. Some candidates couldn't adapt, couldn't force their thinking into frameworks that violated everything their education had taught them about how reality worked. 17 of the original 47 withdrew, said the mathematics made them feel like they were going insane, said trying to visualize 7-dimensional objects was causing psychological breakdown, said they'd rather remain ignorant than damage their sanity attempting to comprehend impossible geometry. But 30 of us persisted. 30 people who discovered we could adapt, could learn to think in ways that felt alien but that the mathematics proved were valid, could train ourselves to accept that our 3-dimensional perception was limited rather than complete, could prepare ourselves to experience spaces that our evolution hadn't prepared us for but that we could survive if we trusted the equations even when they contradicted intuition. Captain Morrison evaluated each of us weekly, assessed psychological stability, measured mathematical comprehension, determined who could handle not just the theory but the reality of dimensional transition, of deliberately folding yourself through frameworks where cause and effect operated differently, where time became navigable, where consciousness might experience things that couldn't be translated back into normal human experience. By January 2025, the crew was finalized. 12 people, 12 individuals judged capable of surviving the journey and representing humanity during First Contact. I was selected as Senior Science Officer. My role, interface with the beacon at Saturn, operate the dimensional transition systems and attempt communication with whatever intelligence we encountered at the destination. The responsibility was overwhelming. The opportunity was irresistible. We would be the first humans to deliberately leave our solar system, the first to use alien technology for interstellar travel, the first to make contact with civilization that had mastered dimensional engineering millions of years before Earth formed. Threshold 1 was beautiful in the way that functional engineering is beautiful. No wasted mass, no aesthetic considerations beyond what efficiency demanded. The ship was 147 meters long. Modular construction, crew habitat at the forward section, life support and supplies in the central modules. Dimensional transition drive at the aft section. The drive itself was constructed according to beacon specifications. created localized distortions in space-time geometry, generated stable corridors through higher dimensional frameworks, required power output equivalent to a small fusion reactor, which the ship carried on precise mathematical calibration to ensure the transition didn't tear the ship apart or deposit us in dimensional spaces we couldn't escape from. The engineers explained the risks, explained that dimensional travel wasn't like conventional propulsion, wasn't moving through space, was changing which space you occupied, was transitioning from our three-dimensional framework to seven-dimensional framework where the 47 light-year distance to the destination system became a trivial displacement, was navigating through spaces where our instruments could barely function and where human perception would experience things that might not translate into coherent memory afterward. Previous unmanned tests had been successful, probes had transitioned, traveled, and returned, but conscious beings might experience dimensional travel differently, might perceive the frameworks we passed through, might be changed by exposure to spaces human neurology wasn't designed to access. Captain Morrison was direct about survival probability. The mathematics says this works. The probes confirm the mathematics. But we're the first humans attempting this. The first conscious observers. Quantum mechanics suggests observation affects outcomes. We don't know if being conscious during dimensional transition will alter the process, will create instabilities, will result in experiences that damage human psychology. The Council's models estimate 73% probability of mission success with all crew returning intact, 18% probability of partial success with some crew experiencing permanent psychological effects, 9% probability of catastrophic failure where the ship doesn't successfully transition or can't return. You're volunteering for uncertain survival, for potentially permanent alteration of consciousness, for the possibility that you'll experience things that make normal human existence impossible afterward. We launched on February 15, 2025. Departed from L2 station with send-off from the Council, representatives who'd spent 8 decades preparing for this moment, 4 months of travel to Saturn using conventional ion propulsion, 4 months to review the mission parameters, to study everything known about the beacon network, to prepare psychologically for contact, to accept that we were about to attempt something unprecedented, something that would either demonstrate humanity was ready to join a galactic community or prove we'd crossed technological thresholds before developing the wisdom to use that technology responsibly. We reached Saturn orbit on June 22nd, positioned threshold 1 at the L4 Lagrange point, 17,000 kilometers from the beacon, close enough for detailed observation, close enough for the ship's sensors to map the structure's 7-dimensional extent, close enough to feel, and I mean feel, not just intellectually understand but physically sense the beacon's presence. It wasn't just an object, it was aware, was broadcasting not just mathematical instructions but attention, was perceiving us, was recognizing that we'd arrived, was waiting to see what we'd do next. I initiated contact using protocols developed from Artemis 9's experience, transmitted mathematical sequences, prime numbers, geometric progressions, universal constants, anything that would demonstrate intelligence and peaceful intent. The beacon responded within 17 seconds. Not with radio signals but with gravitational waves, with ripples in space-time geometry that our instruments detected and that carried information encoded in the wave patterns. The message was clear: acknowledgement, recognition, welcome, and coordinates, precise specifications for where to position the ship to safely access the dimensional bridge. We maneuvered to the specified coordinates, positioned threshold 1 exactly where the beacon indicated, and we felt it. Felt space changing around us, felt gravity becoming flexible, felt the boundary between our three-dimensional framework and higher dimensional spaces becoming permeable. The ship's instruments detected the corridor forming, detected a stable pathway opening through 7-dimensional spacetime, detected the route to the destination system becoming accessible. All we had to do was activate the dimensional drive and trust that the mathematics was correct. Trust that the beacon wouldn't destroy us. Trust that whoever built this network wanted contact rather than cataloging another failed civilization that couldn't survive the transition to dimensional travel. Captain Morrison gave the order at 14:22 UTC on June 23, 2025. Engage dimensional drive. All crew to transition stations, prepare for framework displacement. I activated the systems, watched the power reading spike, watched space-time geometry around the ship distort according to the equations we'd been studying for 8 months. Watched reality fold, and then I experienced something that language can't adequately describe because language evolved to describe. Three-dimensional experience and what happened during dimensional transition existed outside that framework entirely. We didn't move, we transitioned, changed states, shifted from existing in 3 dimensions to existing in 7. And the additional 4 dimensions weren't abstract mathematical constructs, they were real, were accessible, were perceptible in ways that made normal human perception seem like seeing the world through a narrow slit in a wall. I could perceive time, not experience it linearly, perceive it, see past and future simultaneously, see the history of the ship's construction, see the moment we'd arrive at the destination, see my own timeline as a structure I could examine from perspectives that made sequential experience seem arbitrary. I could perceive the beacon's full extent, not just its three-dimensional projection but its actual seven-dimensional form. Could see that it was vast, incomprehensibly vast. That the 340-kilometer structure we'd measured was just a tiny cross-section of something that extended across dimensional frameworks in ways that made spatial measurement meaningless. And I could perceive others, other travelers, other ships using the beacon network, not physically present in our corridor but visible across dimensional boundaries. Could see that we weren't alone in attempting this journey. That hundreds, maybe thousands of civilizations were using the network simultaneously. We're traveling between star systems, we're participating in something galactic in scope. We're all connected through dimensional frameworks that made distance and separation temporary conditions rather than fundamental barriers. The transition lasted subjective hours. Objective time measured by the ship's clocks was 17 seconds. 17 seconds during which we traveled 47 light years, during which we crossed distance that would require centuries at light speed, during which we experienced consciousness in frameworks that human evolution never prepared us for. And then we emerged, returned to three-dimensional space, found ourselves in orbit around a star that wasn't our sun, in a system that wasn't our solar system. 47 light-years from Earth measured by conventional geometry, but only 17 seconds from Earth measured by the path we'd traveled. The destination system contained a beacon identical to Saturn's, and surrounding it was the facility, the structure designed for first contact, the embassy. It was massive, dwarfed even the beacons, measured thousands of kilometers across, contained environments suitable for dozens of different biochemistries, contained spaces designed for beings that existed in various dimensional frameworks, contained everything necessary for civilizations from across hundreds of light years to gather and communicate despite potentially having nothing in common except having achieved dimensional travel capability. And it was occupied. The sensors detected ships, detected structures we couldn't fully characterize, detected life signs using metrics that barely made sense applied to beings that might not be biological in any way we'd recognize, detected that we weren't just making first contact with whoever built the network, we were joining something, some community, some collection of civilizations that had all reached the same technological threshold and had all accepted the same invitation and had all chosen to participate in whatever this network represented. Captain Morrison broadcast on all frequencies, transmitted every greeting protocol we'd prepared, transmitted mathematical proofs of intelligence, transmitted everything we could think of to announce our presence and our peaceful intent, and the facility responded, not with language, not with any communication medium we'd anticipated, with something else, with direct transfer of information into our consciousness, with what the theoretical physicists had called dimensional resonance communication, with meaning conveyed directly rather than through symbolic intermediaries. The message was clear despite being transmitted in ways that bypassed normal sensory processing. Welcome. You have arrived. You have crossed the threshold. You are now part of the network. You will learn. You will grow. You will contribute. You are no longer isolated. You are no longer alone. You are home. We docked with a facility on June 24, 2025, 12 humans stepping into a structure built by intelligence that existed across 7 dimensions. 12 representatives of a species that had just discovered we were part of something vast and ancient and incomprehensibly complex. 12 people about to learn what it meant to join a galactic community that measured membership not by biology or culture but by the simple criterion of having achieved dimensional engineering and chosen to use it for connection rather than isolation. This is Dr. Sarah Chen, Science Officer aboard Threshold 1, first human to successfully navigate the beacon network, first to make contact with the facility at the destination system, recording this on June 25, 2025, from inside a structure that exists partially in dimensions I still can't fully perceive. We're here, we're safe, we're learning, and we're not alone. We've never been alone. 17 beacons in our solar system. 17 pathways to other civilizations. 17 opportunities to join something larger than human. We chose to follow the first pathway, chose to accept the invitation, chose to become dimensional travelers, and everything has changed. Everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe has transformed. We're not the apex of intelligence, we're students. Children taking first steps into a reality far more complex than our three-dimensional perception suggested. The beings here I can't describe them because they don't have forms that translate into visual description are welcoming, patient, ready to teach, ready to help us understand dimensional engineering at levels beyond what the beacons could transmit, ready to integrate us into networks spanning hundreds of civilizations across thousands of light years, all connected through dimensional frameworks that make interstellar communication instantaneous and interstellar travel routine. We're returning to Earth in 90 days. Returning with proof, with documentation, with everything necessary to convince humanity that the beacons are invitations we should accept rather than threats we should fear. Returning to help manage the disclosure that's inevitable, to help prepare civilization for the reality that we're part of something vast, that isolation was temporary, that the universe is crowded with intelligence operating at scales we're only beginning to comprehend. The journey continues, the teaching continues, the awakening continues. We crossed the threshold, and we're ready for what comes next. Recording ends June 25, 2025. Threshold 1 status. Operational crew status. INTACT consciousness, expanded first contact, successful return trajectory, planned humanity's future. Dimensional. The network awaits. 17 pathways remain. The invitation stands. We are nitrogen monoxide longer alone.